My name is Velis Dune. I am a compile correspondent for the Galactic Species Observation Bureau, which means I am the one who sits down after something goes wrong and tries to make sense of it. I collect testimonies. I stitch them together. I try to build a picture from the pieces other people experienced. I've done this work for 11 years. I have compiled post-incident accounts from 32 different species observation stations. I've written about the Marathi swarm event on Pollux 6. I've documented the misidentification catastrophe on Yena Station, where 3 xenobiologists mistook a juvenile for a docile specimen, and it was not docile at all. I've seen confusion and shock and genuine terror in the eyes of researchers who thought they understood something, and then discovered they did not. I have never, not once, in 11 years, sat down to compile a report where every single witness, without exception, used some version of the same phrase when I asked them to describe the moment it clicked. The phrase was, "I thought I was watching an animal die. Then I realized I was watching it hunt." Every single witness, different species, different departments, different vantage points across the canyon ridge, all of them landed on some version of that sentence. That's why this report exists. That's why the Galactic Species Observation Bureau pulled 17 researchers out of their regular rotation and assigned them to compile witness testimony for 43 days. That's why you're reading this. Because what happened in Thornwood Canyon on day 188 of the terrestrial field year was not an anomaly in the way scientists use that word, meaning an outlier, a single data point that doesn't fit the curve. What happened was a correction. The data point didn't fail to fit the curve. The curve had been wrong, and the data point proved it. This is the account of that correction. First testimony, Senior Field Observer Raccoon. Species Valorian, post in Station 9, lead behavioral analyst 7 years. Interviewed on day 3 post-incident. I will start at the beginning of that day, which is where you have to start if you want any of it to make sense. We had been watching the human for 19 days at that point. His designation in our system was TH944, which stands for Terrestrial Humanoid, Station 9, Subject 44. His actual name, which we learned later, was Marcus Drain, but we didn't use names in the field logs. We used designations because names create sympathy and sympathy creates bias and bias creates bad science. That was the doctrine. That was what we were trained to do. TH944 was a male human, mid to late life stage by Terran reckoning, later confirmed to be 54 standard years of age. He had been flagged for observation because his movement patterns in the canyon region were unusual. He moved through the territory of multiple large predators on a regular basis. He moved through it calmly. Our initial assessment was that he was unaware of the predators, that he was one of those creatures that wanders into danger zones due to insufficient sensory capacity. We see that occasionally in prey species. They don't know the cat is behind the rock because their nose isn't good enough and their ears are too small. They wander. They die. We thought TH944 was a wanderer. He had a bag he carried on his back, a large structured pack, soft-sided, gray-green in color. He had sticks in his hands that he used to walk, not because his legs failed him. We established that early on, but by choice, as a balancing tool and as a kind of sensory extension, tapping the ground, feeling terrain through the stick before he committed weight to a step. He had a narrow tool on his wrist that he consulted regularly. He wore clothing that matched the rock and shrub of the canyon. His boots were substantial, heavy material, ankle support, specialized tread. All of this we noted. None of it changed our assessment. We wrote, in 17 different field logs across 19 days, some variation of, subject appears unaware of predator proximity. Continued observation recommended prior to alert protocol consideration. The last log before the incident, filed at 0600 on day 188, stated, TH944 has entered grid square 44G again. 3 apex predator signatures active in 44G. Subject is moving west at reduced pace. No alarm response noted. Risk assessment high. Continued observation. We were still watching, still waiting for something that looked like awareness of danger, still categorizing him as potential prey. Then the leopard moved. Second testimony, Field Observer Tethys Vo. Species Zalosi. Post in Station 9. Wildlife Behavior Tracking Junior Analyst, second year. Interviewed on Day 5 post-incident. I was on the sensor array when it started. I was the one who flagged the leopard at 0912. The leopard, the station database had it cataloged as Panthera pardus, subspecies unspecified, estimated mass 78 kilograms, sex undetermined, age range 7 to 10 years. We called it scarback in the station because it had a distinctive healed wound pattern across its left shoulder that showed up clearly on thermal imaging. Scarback was, by every metric we had, the most aggressive of the 3 apex predators active in Grid 44G that morning. It had killed a rival predator in that same canyon region 11 days prior. It had displaced 2 other large predators from prime hunting sites in a 3-day stretch earlier in the observation cycle. It was fast and it was competent, and it was, when it chose to hunt, completely committed. It had been watching TH944 for 22 minutes before I flagged it. I know that because when I pulled the timeline after the incident, the thermal logs showed the leopard in position, low, flat, rear legs coiled starting at 0850. It hadn't moved. It had just watched. And in that 22 minutes, TH944 had come steadily, slowly, calmly west down the canyon floor, which is a narrow place with high walls on both sides and almost no room to maneuver, and the leopard had been above him on the left wall at the narrowest section. It was a textbook ambush position, elevated, down trail. The leopard had the height advantage, the surprise advantage, the positional advantage. It had 80 kilograms of muscle and claw and fang. TH944 was a medium-sized biped with soft-sided boots and 2 sticks. I flagged the alert, sent it to Raccoon, and pulled my visual feed to the main screen because what I expected to see was a predation event. In our documentation, those are coded as PE. They are significant but not unusual. They are part of the ecological record. I was going to watch a predation event. That is not what I watched. Third testimony, Station Commander Yovla San. Species Drellin, post in Station 9, Station Commander 11 years, interviewed on Day 2 post-incident. I want to be clear about something before I describe what I saw, because I've read the preliminary incident log, and I think the language there undersells it considerably. I've commanded observation stations for 2 decades across 4 different systems. I have watched predation events on 17 different worlds. I understand the mathematics of predator and prey. I understand mass ratios and sprint speeds and the geometry of an ambush. I understand all of that at a very technical level. None of that prepared me for what TH944 did. When the alert came in, I was in my office reviewing the weekly behavioral reports. I pulled the visual feed on my personal screen. What I saw was the canyon, gray rock, morning shadow, the long, narrow floor of Grid 44G. And I could see TH944 in the bottom of that canyon, picking his way west, and I could see on the thermal overlay the hot signature of the leopard above him, and I could see the geometry of it, the inevitability of it. I expected to see the leopard launch. I expected to see it drop from that ledge and land on TH944, and that would be the end of TH944's contribution to the station records. Instead, TH944 stopped. Not in panic, not with any visible startling reaction. He just stopped. He stood still in the middle of the canyon floor with his walking sticks planted in the dirt in front of him, and he looked up and to the left, and he looked directly at the ledge where the leopard was hiding. From 17 meters below, in morning shadow. Without any instrumentation that we detected. He looked directly at it. And then this is the part I want you to understand clearly. He set down his pack. He set it down slowly, deliberately on the canyon floor in front of him. He reached into it. He pulled out something, and I couldn't identify it at first because our visual feed at that angle wasn't precise enough to resolve fine detail. But it was something he had prepared, something he brought with him, something he had in his pack ready. I said to Tethys, who was at the sensor array, I said, "Is he armed?" And Tethys said, "I don't know what I'm looking at." That was the moment I knew we had been wrong about TH-944. I didn't know in what way yet. I didn't know the scope of it. But that calm, deliberate, prepared response to a predator he should not have been able to detect, that was not prey behavior. I have seen enough prey behavior in my career to recognize it, and I was not seeing it. Chapter 2, the 19 days before. I need to back up, because none of what happened in Thornwood Canyon on day 188 makes sense without understanding the 19 days that preceded it. And the 19 days don't make sense without understanding who Marcus Drain was and what he was doing in that canyon region in the first place. The Bureau's files on Drain, compiled during the initial processing phase that followed the incident, are extensive. I'll use them here alongside witness testimony because the documented record fills in gaps that no single witness observed. From the Bureau's subject file, TH-944, full biographical extract. Marcus Drain, age 54. Born in the northern mountain region of the North American continent, Earth, Sol system. Father, wilderness guide, 40 years in service. Mother, field paramedic, retired. Grew up in what Terran records describe as a high country environment, meaning a mountainous, forested, ecologically complex zone with multiple large predator species present throughout his childhood. Education, formal Terran schooling through mid-level. Post that, informal, apprentice to his father at age 14. By age 17, he was guiding independently in his region. By age 22, he held certification in what Terrans call wilderness survival instruction, meaning he taught others how to navigate, sustain, and defend themselves in non-urban environments. He held that certification for 32 years, active teaching. Employment record, wilderness guide, survival instructor, search and rescue consultant. The search and rescue notation is significant. It means Terran authorities called him in when someone was lost or injured in remote areas. He had 440 documented active search and rescue operations over a career spanning roughly 30 years. He had found, rescued, or recovered individuals from environments ranging from high-altitude snow fields to dense jungle terrain. The recovery notation on 12 of those operations means he was recovering remains rather than survivors, which means he operated in zones where things had already gone wrong, and he went anyway. Species interaction record. In his professional career, Drain had documented encounters with what Terran records classify as dangerous wildlife, including 4 subspecies of bear, 2 subspecies of large wild cat, one of which was, specifically, a leopard, multiple venomous snake species, and at least one animal described in the file as a feral ungulate in aggressive state, which our biology team had to look up before they understood what it meant. The 4-legged hooved animal equivalent. It had attacked him. He had escaped without serious injury. There is a note in the margin of the Bureau file, added by the behavioral analyst who processed the biographical extract. It says, "Why did we not read this earlier?" It is a fair question. The honest answer is that we read it and we didn't understand what we were reading. We saw a creature that lived in the same territory as predators, and we filed it under unaware prey without asking why it was still alive. Fourth testimony, Field Observer Goss Mederin. Species Palian, post in Station 9, ecological mapping 3 years. Interviewed on day 6 post-incident. I was the one who had done most of the movement pattern logging for TH-944 in the 14 days before the incident. I want to explain what I saw in retrospect, because during those 14 days, I wasn't understanding what I was seeing. His routes were not random. I thought they were at first. He moved in a pattern that seemed chaotic, different directions each day, different starting times, different paces. He would go fast on open ground and slow near terrain transitions. He would stop for long periods in elevated positions, not resting, not based on any behavioral indicator I could read, but looking, scanning, turning slowly and covering visual arcs the way a surveillance instrument would. I logged it as erratic prey behavior, which is actually a real thing. Some prey species display seemingly random movement patterns because random is harder to predict. I thought that was what I was seeing. It was not random. In retrospect, the pattern is completely clear and it is the opposite of prey behavior. He was reading the ground. He was logging terrain. He was identifying approach routes, sight lines, and cover positions not for himself to hide, but to understand where a predator could hide relative to his own path. He was threat mapping. He was, in the vocabulary of his own species' tactical tradition, doing reconnaissance. He had been doing reconnaissance of the canyon system for 2.5 weeks before the leopard chose to engage him. When I look back at his path, the path he had walked every day for 19 days, I understand now that the path through the narrowest section of 44G, the section where Scarback had set the ambush, was deliberate. He walked through that section every single day, at slightly different times, at slightly different paces, always in the same direction, always west, into the narrowest part, where the walls rose on both sides and there was minimum lateral escape room. Why would a prey animal, if it knew about predators, walk deliberately into the least defensible position in the entire canyon system? It wouldn't. But something that wanted to draw a predator into an engagement on terms it had chosen, that might do exactly that. Fifth testimony, Dr. Passavren. Species Marathi, post in Station 9, xenobiology specialist, 12 years, interviewed on day 8 post-incident. I want to talk about what we missed in our physiological assessment of TH944, because it matters. Our initial field assessment described his sensory capabilities as follows: visual acuity, moderate, binocular, limited lateral range; olfactory, poor; auditory, moderate. That assessment was based on standard species profile data for Homo sapiens that we had in our database, compiled from earlier Bureau studies of the species in lower stress environments. What we failed to account for is the degree to which individual training and long-term environmental conditioning can modify effective sensory utilization. Not the sensory apparatus itself. The ears, the nose, the eyes of TH944 were within species standard parameters, but the processing of sensory input, the use of secondary indicators, the integration of information streams that an inexperienced member of his species would not know how to read. He was not smelling the leopard, but he was reading the environment for the signs of the leopard: change in bird behavior, wind direction relative to terrain features, shadow patterns on the canyon wall that didn't match the ambient light angle, disturbance in the loose rock on the ledge surface. He later described this as a slight sound, a shift, like someone adjusting position on gravel, which occurred when the leopard moved fractionally while tracking him at 0920. He heard the leopard shift its weight on a gravel surface from 17 meters, while moving through a canyon where ambient sound included wind, his own footsteps, and the creek in the lower section of the gorge. And he filed that single sound, combined with the other environmental data he had been accumulating, into a conclusion: predator, elevated left side, above narrow section. Our species profile data said the Terran human had moderate auditory capability. That was not wrong, but it did not describe Marcus Drain. What Marcus Drain had was something that didn't fit in our standard sensory capability taxonomy, and it took us 8 days of post-incident analysis to name it properly. Attention, pure, trained, relentless, practiced attention. He paid attention in a way that our assessment framework did not have a category for. And paying attention, it turned out, was more useful in a canyon with a leopard in it than anything our species profile database had imagined. Chapter 3: The Moment It Changed. Back to Thornwood Canyon. Grid 44G0912 on day 188. The station visual feed now showed in combined thermal optical overlay the following scene. Scarback, coiled on the ledge above the canyon's narrowest point, 18 meters from TH-944's current position. TH-944 stopped and looking upward. Pack on the ground in front of him. Object removed from pack. Identity not yet resolved in station feed. 7 station personnel were now watching the feed in real time. 3 more were alerted and pulling their individual terminals. The behavioral analysis room had its main screen on the canyon visual. Station Commander Yov Lassan was standing behind Tethys Vo at the sensor array. Nobody was breathing very much. 6th testimony, Observer Trinikel Sasso. Species Drellin, post in Station 9, first rotation, general observation 6 months in, interviewed on day 4 post-incident. I was the youngest person in that room that morning. I had been in my rotation for 6 months and I had genuinely never seen an incident like what I was looking at. I had seen predation events. I had seen prey animals react, flee, get caught. I understood the basic pattern. I did not understand what TH-944 was doing. He had pulled from his pack, and I could see it more clearly now on the feed because he had moved to a slightly different position. He had pulled a long, thin tool, smooth material, dark-colored, tapered. He held it in both hands, not by one end the way you would hold a weapon to strike with, but in the middle, balanced, fingers spread along the shaft. He held it horizontally across his body at roughly waist height. He was looking at the ledge. He was not moving. The leopard was not moving. They were watching each other. I had never in 6 months of observation work seen a scenario where a creature flagged in our system as potential prey was engaged in a mutual observation standoff with an ambush predator that had already committed to a launch position. Prey doesn't do that. Prey detects predators and runs. Prey that can't run panics. Prey that can't panic freezes in a maladaptive response that ends badly. TH-944 was doing none of those things. He was standing in the middle of the canyon floor with a long tool in his hands, and he was looking up at the leopard with an expression that and I understand this is my subjective interpretation and may not be reliable, an expression that I can only describe as assessment. He was assessing it. Raccoon standing behind me said very quietly, "That's not how prey stands." And there was a long moment of silence in the observation room, because Raccoon was right, and none of us knew what to do with that. 7th testimony, Raccoon continued. "I'll take up the account from that point. When I said what I said, that's not how prey stands, I meant it as an observation, not a conclusion. I still wasn't ready to call what I was seeing. 17 pages of analysis, 19 days of data. You don't throw that away in 1 second because of a posture." But the posture was wrong. Even on the feed, even at distance, even with all the uncertainty of species-specific behavioral reading across phylogenetic lines, the posture was wrong for prey. His weight was centered. His feet were planted at shoulder width. His hands were controlling the tool with a very specific grip, not a panic grip, not a defensive grip, but a balanced, ready grip. His head was raised and he was tracking the leopard the way I have watched apex predators track prey. Constant, smooth. Accounting for the animal's potential movement paths, not just its current position. He was mapping the leopard's escape routes. I want you to understand how strange that is. We have 17 taxonomic categories for predator behavior in our system. We have 11 for prey behavior. At 0914 on day 188, TH-944 did not fit into any of them. He was doing something we didn't have a category for. He was a prey-classified creature exhibiting apex predator threat assessment behavior against a confirmed apex predator in an ambush scenario. I said, and I want this in the record because it matters, suspend the predation event code. This is something else. Tethys looked at me. She didn't argue. She suspended the code. Chapter 4, The Hunt. What happened next took 11 minutes. I have reviewed the visual logs from 0914 to 0925 multiple times. I have watched it frame by frame. I have written a behavioral analysis of it that runs to 68 pages, and I still find new things to note on each review. But I will describe it here in narrative terms because the frame-by-frame analysis is technical documentation, and this account needs to be something that other beings can actually understand. At 0914, TH-944 made his first move. It was not toward the exit. It was not away from the Leopard. It was not a defensive posture. He moved toward the wall. The left canyon wall, the same wall the Leopard was sitting above. He moved toward it slowly and deliberately, keeping his eyes on the ledge, keeping the long tool across his body, and he moved to a position approximately 4 meters from the base of the wall and 2 meters back from directly below the Leopard's position. Eighth testimony, Dr. Passavren continued. When I saw him move toward the wall, I thought it was a mistake, an error, that in his assessment he had miscalculated the position and was inadvertently moving closer to the threat. Then I understood what he was doing, and my thought process reversed completely in the space of about 3 seconds. He was removing the Leopard's angle. If the Leopard launched from its position with TH-944 standing in the middle of the canyon floor, the launch trajectory was clean, 17-meter fall to target, angled approach, full mass impact on the target's upper body or back. Standard large fielded ambush sequence. High probability of immediate incapacitation. But if TH-944 moved 4 meters to the left, to a position close to the wall base, the launch trajectory changed dramatically. The Leopard, to reach him from that angle, would have to launch sideways rather than downward. It would have to clear the wall overhang. Its landing would be compromised. Not a clean impact from above, but a scrambled, partially lateral approach that would cost it momentum and control. He had negated the ambush. Not by running, not by hiding. Not by calling for help or making noise, or doing any of the things our species profile data suggested Terran humans might do in response to large predator proximity. He had negated the ambush by moving to a position that removed the predator's tactical advantage. He had calculated the geometry of the attack before the attack happened, and he had moved himself out of the optimal target zone. I am a xenobiology specialist. I have studied 200 species in a professional capacity. I have never, in 20 years of work, observed a prey-designated creature perform in-field geometric threat analysis and reposition itself based on that analysis during an active ambush scenario. I said to the station commander, "This isn't prey behavior." She said, "I know." Back to Raccoon. After he moved to the wall base, there was a pause. The Leopard hadn't launched. I think the change in target position had confused its committed sequence. Ambush predators set their launch geometry in advance. When the target moves, there's a recalculation period. Scarback went through that recalculation for approximately 90 seconds. In those 90 seconds, TH-944 did something I have to describe carefully because I don't want it misread. He spoke. Not to anyone on any communications device. There was nothing in his ear, nothing on his wrist that we could identify as a communicator. He spoke to the Leopard. Low. Very low. Our audio sensors at that range picked up cadence and tone but struggled with exact phonetic content. But we had it analyzed later, and what he said, or something close to what he said, was, "I see you. I know you're there. You have choices right now, and I'd rather you made a good one." He was talking to the Leopard. I'm going to stop here and acknowledge how strange this is. I have been in behavioral analysis for 7 years, and I have no framework for a creature that, in an active predation threat scenario, speaks to the predator. Not to call for help. Not in distress. And I'm going to use a word that I know sounds wrong for this context, in negotiation. He was negotiating with the leopard. Ninth testimony. Field observer Goss Metarin continued. I want to add something about the way he moved during what came next, because I had been tracking his movement patterns for 14 days, and what I saw it was like watching a different creature from the one I'd been logging. Every day for 14 days he had moved at what I would call casual pace. Steady, efficient, unhurried. The pace of a creature that was comfortable in its environment and had nowhere urgent to be. What I watched during the 11 minutes in the canyon was a precision. Every movement was precise, deliberate, nothing extra. He moved 4 meters left, he stopped. He shifted his grip on the long tool, he stopped. He spoke, he fell silent. He was completely in control of every motion his body made, and the control was so complete it was almost. I struggled to find a word for it, and eventually I went with architectural. His movement was architectural, structured, pre-planned at a level that implied he had rehearsed for this specific type of situation many times. Later I found out that he had, literally. He had been teaching other creatures how to behave in exactly this scenario for 30 years. Back to Raccoon. The Leopard launched at 0919. Not at TH944 directly. Scarback had recalculated, and what it did was not a clean drop ambush. It pushed off the ledge at an angle, trying to land behind and to the right of TH944 and then close from there. Which would have worked, I think, against almost anything that was not TH944. What TH944 did, and this happened in approximately 0.8 seconds, which is why we have the frame-by-frame analysis, was step forward and left simultaneously. He pivoted. His feet moved in a cross step that took him out of the projected landing zone by approximately 0.6 meters, which doesn't sound like much until you understand that the Leopard's landing zone radius was approximately 0.8 meters. He cleared it by 0.2 meters. The Leopard landed where he had been. He was not there. In the same motion, and I mean the same motion, continuous, no pause, he brought the long tool around from the right side and struck the canyon wall with it. Hard, deliberately. The crack of the impact was audible on our audio sensors from the observation station. It was loud and sharp and completely intentional. He was not attacking. He was making noise. Specific, sharp, close proximity noise, at the exact moment the Leopard landed and was in the process of recovering its footing after a jump that didn't connect with its target. Leopards, like most large felids, have a brief orientation moment post-jump. They land, they process the feedback, contact or not, they orient. In that orientation moment, TH944 was already repositioned, and already making a loud, sharp sound from a direction the animal didn't expect. The Leopard spun. It was now facing TH944 from a crouched position, 3 meters between them, and TH944 was standing upright. The long tool held in front of him now in a completely different grip, one hand at each end, the tool horizontal, presented as a barrier. They were looking at each other. TH944 said something again. This time the audio was cleaner, closer range. He said, "There it is. Now we both know where we stand." 10th testimony. Station Commander Yovla San continued. I have never in my life watched a moment like the 4 seconds that followed. I don't know if I have language for it in any tongue I speak. The Leopard was crouched. It was 3 meters from TH944. Its ears were flat. Its tail was lashing. It was making the assessment that predators make when their first strike has missed, and they're deciding whether the cost of a second engagement is worth the potential gain. TH944 was standing, upright, still. The long tool, we identified it later, it was a wooden staff, dense hardwood, roughly 150 centimeters, hand-carved from the visual resolution we eventually achieved, held in a two-handed grip, horizontal, steady. He wasn't advancing, but he wasn't retreating either. He was standing at the engagement distance the leopard had created, and he was holding that distance, and he was looking at the leopard without looking away, and his posture communicated something that I, as a commander of 11 years who has given a lot of thought to what makes a being a threat rather than a target, his posture communicated. The cost is high. Choose whether you want to pay it. The leopard stayed crouched for 4 seconds, 4 full seconds, I counted, long enough that I was genuinely uncertain what it would decide. Then it stood up. Not an attack crouch. It just stood up, smooth and fluid, and it looked at TH-944 for 1 more second, and then it turned, and in 3 bounds it was back up the canyon wall and over the ledge and gone. The leopard left. The apex predator left a confrontation with a creature we had flagged as potential prey. It left. Chapter 5, The Aftermath in the Canyon. TH-944 stood in the middle of the canyon floor for approximately 2 minutes after the leopard departed. He did not relax immediately. He kept the tool ready, kept his position, kept scanning the canyon walls and the trail ahead. He was confirming that the departure was genuine, that there was no second predator, no repositioning, no renewed approach. 2 minutes. 120 seconds of continued vigilance after the threat had withdrawn. Then slowly he lowered the staff. He exhaled, audible on our sensors, a long, controlled exhalation. He picked up his pack from where he had set it. He slung it onto his back. He picked up his walking sticks. And he continued west. Same pace as before, steady, efficient, unhurried, as if the 11 minutes had not happened. 11th testimony, Observatrini Kel Sasso continued. When he just walked away and kept going, I had to physically step back from my station for a second because I didn't know what I was feeling. Relief, shock, something else I don't have a word for. I looked at Raccoon. Raccoon was looking at the feed where TH-944 was just walking west in the morning light, like nothing happened. Raccoon said, "Someone needs to revise 19 days of field logs." And nobody laughed, not because it wasn't absurd. It was absolutely absurd, but we were all in some version of the same state, recalibrating, trying to figure out what we actually knew now about TH-944. About humans. 12th testimony, Dr. Passavren continued. I will tell you what I understood in the first hour after the incident, before I had done any analysis, because I think the raw first-hour understanding is worth documenting separately from the processed 43-day conclusion. What I understood was this: we had made a category error, a massive, systematic, completely avoidable category error. We had looked at a creature that was soft and medium-sized and traveled through dangerous terrain calmly, and we had called it unaware prey. We had a database full of species profile data that told us humans had moderate sensory capability and no natural armor and no natural weapons. And we had taken that profile and we had applied it blindly to a specific individual human, without asking whether that individual's life history might have produced something the profile didn't account for. We had profile data, we had zero context. And context was everything. Because TH-944's biology was not extraordinary. His senses were species standard. His body was species standard. He had no physical attribute that would cause any biologist to say this one is different from the others. He was a standard-issue human body by every metric we measured. What was not standard was what he had done with that body over 54 years. What he had loaded into it, the skills, the patterns, the reflexes, the knowledge, the 30 years of walking into exactly the kind of situation he had walked into that morning and walking back out again, the 30 years of teaching others to do the same. He was not a different kind of human. He was what happens to a human when a human spends a lifetime learning how to survive. We had been looking at the hardware and missing the software entirely. Chapter 6. The Conversation. At 11:40 on day 188, Station Commander Yovla San made a decision that is not in the standard Bureau operational protocol. She broke observation silence. Station Commander Yovla San continued. I want to be direct about this. What I did was not sanctioned. I radioed headquarters and requested authorization, and headquarters told me to maintain observation silence. And I told headquarters that I respectfully disagreed with that instruction in this case. And I was going to break silence anyway, and they could review my conduct afterward. They reviewed my conduct afterward. The review committee decided I was right to break silence, but that's afterward. In the moment, I broke silence because I had just watched TH-944 engage a 78-kilogram apex predator in a one-on-one confrontation in an enclosed canyon, and win by a combination of situational analysis, threat geometry, tactical repositioning, and a specific kind of nerve that I think deserves a better word than nerve: composure. Composure is the word. And I could not continue to observe this being as though he were a specimen when what I had just watched was something closer to mastery. So I activated the first contact protocol, not the emergency version, the slow one, the we'd like to talk version. And I had Tethys put the localized audio broadcast on the standard band 7 frequency, which the Bureau uses for voluntary civilian contact on worlds where the species has achieved basic technological capability. I said in Terran English, which we have had in our language databases for the better part of a generation, Marcus Drain, this is the Galactic Species Observation Bureau, Sector 9 Station. We would like to speak with you if you're willing. There was a pause of about 40 seconds. Then TH-944, then Marcus Drain stopped on the canyon trail. He looked up. He looked around. He looked at the sky with an expression that I could not quite read, and then he said to the air, to nobody visible, I was wondering when you were going to say something. 13th testimony, Marcus Drain. Species Homo sapiens Terran. Subject TH-944. Interviewed beginning day 14 post-incident over 7 sessions. Testimony compiled and edited for inclusion in this report. You want to know about the Leopard, I understand that. But first you have to know about the canyon, and before that you have to know about why I was in that canyon at all. And before that you have to know that when I was 19 years old, I watched a man die, because he thought that knowing the names of animals was the same as knowing the animals. He was a colleague of my father's. Smart man, well-read, had written papers on wilderness ecology. He knew the Latin classifications. He could talk for an hour about habitat ranges and dietary patterns. He knew the data. He walked into a creek drainage in late afternoon in September, which in our mountains is the start of the feeding push before winter, which means the bears are active and feeding hard and not particularly interested in sharing space. He walked in there and he didn't read the sign, the turned-over rocks, the hair on the brush, the scat, the prints in the mud by the water. He didn't read the sign because he was looking at his map and thinking about the academic paper he was planning to write. He didn't see the bear until the bear was on him. He didn't survive the encounter. I was 19, and I was the one who found him the next morning on the search and rescue call. And I want to tell you that there are things a 19-year-old shouldn't see, but also things that, once seen, teach you with absolute clarity what you need to pay attention to for the rest of your life. After that, I paid attention. I paid attention for 35 years, to everything, to the sound of birds going quiet and what direction it came from, to the weight of wind and what it tells you about where it's been, to the pressure of silence in a place that should not be silent, to the way light moves on rock surfaces and whether it moves the way the ambient conditions should produce, or whether something warm and alive is creating shadow where there shouldn't be shadow. I paid attention because the world I worked in was genuinely dangerous, and the people who survived in genuinely dangerous worlds, in my experience, were not the ones with the best gear or the most knowledge. They were the ones who paid the most attention. The leopard scarback, you called it, yes. I know the animal. I'd been tracking it for 3 weeks before you started observing me, long before you started observing me. I'd found its sign in 6 different places in the canyon system. I knew its territory, its routes, its habits. I knew it had a healed injury on its left side that made it favor its right in close engagements. I knew it was bold enough to have taken a rival predator recently because I found the remains and the tracks told the story. I knew it was a canyon ambusher by preference because the track patterns showed it using elevated positions. I walked through its ambush zone every day because I wanted to understand it better. I wanted to know if it would engage a human, and if so, at what point and from what position, and what it would do when the engagement didn't go the way it expected. So, in a sense, I was observing Scarback the same way you were observing me. I just didn't have the satellite uplink. 14th testimony. Station Commander Yovla San continued. When Drain said he had been observing the leopard, I felt several things in sequence, very fast. First, astonishment, because our entire frame had been inverted so completely and so quickly that I was still catching up. Second, embarrassment, because the observer had been observed and the observer had been doing it better. Third, something that I want to be accurate about and not oversell, but it was something like respect. A very specific kind of respect. The kind you feel when you encounter mastery in a domain you didn't know existed. I asked him, "Did you know we were watching you?" He said not specifically, but something was watching. I felt the attention. I asked him what that meant. He said, when something is paying close attention to you in the field, the environment changes. The birds change. The way the air sits changes. After enough years you feel it. I didn't know what was watching. I thought maybe it was government, some kind of wildlife tracking operation. I figured whoever it was would say something eventually if they wanted to. He had felt the attention of 17 xenobiologists with sensor arrays and thermal imaging and audio monitoring, and he had categorized it accurately as something paying close attention, and he had simply waited for us to introduce ourselves. We had been watching him for 19 days. He had been aware of being watched for how long, he said, was hard to say exactly, but probably since around day 4 or 5. Chapter 7. The conversation about the categories. The first conversation I had directly with Marcus Drain. Station Commander San patched me into the audio relay on day 14 so I could begin my compilation work. Lasted 4 hours. We covered many things, but there's a section of it I want to include here because I think it addresses something that runs all the way through this report. I asked him, after he had been speaking for some time about his work in the mountains, whether he had ever thought of himself as prey. He looked at me. We were doing video by then. The Bureau had set up a proper communication link, and he had an expression that I read as genuine puzzlement. Not offense, not amusement, pure puzzlement, like I had asked something that didn't quite make grammatical sense. He said, "No, I've thought of myself as a guest." I asked what he meant. He said, "The mountains are not mine. The Leopard's Canyon is not mine. When I go into those places, I'm going in as a visitor, which means I have to understand the rules of the place, the people, the animals, the predators who live there. I have to understand what I'm walking into, not because I'm afraid of being eaten, though that's real enough, but because if I don't understand where I am, I can't do my job. And my job has always been to bring people in and bring them back out." I asked, "Does that mean you don't see the leopard as a threat?" He said, "Oh, it absolutely is a threat. Scarback could have killed me this morning if any of a dozen things had gone differently. I know that. I take that very seriously. The difference between me and someone who gets killed by a leopard, in my experience, is not that they thought it was dangerous and I didn't. We both know it's dangerous. The difference is that I've spent a long time thinking about exactly how it would try to kill me and what I would do about it if it did. I've thought about that in advance, in a lot of detail, and then I've practiced it. The leopard surprised me a little with the ledge position. I thought it might use the overhang on the east side. But once I had the position, the rest was a version of something I'd prepared for. He had prepared for an ambush by a large field in an enclosed canyon space. He had thought about it in advance. He had practiced responses. He had done all of this before he ever set foot in the canyon, and he had continued to refine his understanding with every day he spent in the territory. I said, "We classified you as potential prey." He said, and his voice was not unkind, "I know. I read a lot, and I knew a little bit about how observation bureaus work. I figured that's what I would look like from a distance, slow, soft, no fangs, no claws, going right through the most dangerous terrain. I probably looked like something walking to its own funeral." He paused. Then he said, "The thing is, and I mean this genuinely, not as criticism, the categories fail when you're dealing with something that doesn't operate on the biological terms. I'm not faster than the leopard. I'm not stronger. My senses are worse by every objective measure, but I'm older than the leopard. I have had more conversations with myself about what a leopard would do in this exact situation than the leopard has had conversations with itself about what I would do. And that asymmetry of preparation, that's not a biological fact. It's not in your species profile. It's a fact about what I've done with my years, not about what I was born with." 15th testimony. Dr. Passavren continued. Drain's description of what he called asymmetry of preparation became the core conceptual problem that the Bureau's post-incident working group spent 6 weeks wrestling with. The problem is this: our species classification system is built on biological parameters: mass, sensory acuity, natural weapons, observed behavioral range. These are all things that can be measured in the field without subject cooperation. They are objective, replicable, species-level data. What they cannot capture is what a specific individual of a given species has done with their biology over decades of intentional effort. What they cannot capture is the degree to which a sufficiently trained individual can systematically compensate for biological limitations through acquired knowledge, physical skill, and, the most difficult to quantify of all, the right relationship with fear. Because Drain was afraid during the encounter. He said this clearly and without embarrassment in our interviews. He described his physiological state during the confrontation as high alert, controlled, which he translated for us as elevated heart rate, heightened sensory sensitivity, and what he called the good kind of fear, the kind that sharpens you instead of freezing you. He had fear, he used it. He used it as a tool. Our species profile data on Homo sapiens notes that they have a well-documented fear response to apex predator proximity. This is accurate. It is also useless as a predictive tool for Marcus Drain, because the species-level data cannot know that this particular human had spent 30 years learning to run fear like a system, rather than letting fear run him. The profile describes the hardware. The history is the software, and we had been reading the hardware and ignoring the software entirely. I have included this section because I believe intellectual honesty requires it, even though some of what Drain said in our extended interviews was unflattering to the Bureau and its methods. He was not hostile. I want to be clear about that. He was direct and he was honest, and he never raised his voice, and he seemed genuinely interested in the exchange rather than in scoring points. But he had things to say about our methods that I think deserve to be in this record. Marcus Drain continued. Here's what I want to say about observation, and you can take it or leave it. The best trackers I've known, the people who taught me, The ones I've taught who went on to be genuinely good at this, all of them had one quality that separated them from everyone else. They could hold their categories loosely. They had categories. You have to have categories. You can't operate in complex environments without mental models, but they held those categories as provisional, as the best current guess, not the established truth. The worst outcomes I've seen in the field always came from someone who was certain, who had the data, had the model, and committed to it completely without leaving room for what the data might be missing. Your people had 17 pages of analysis on me. I'm not questioning the quality of the observations. What I'm questioning is whether there was space in those 17 pages for the question, what if the model is wrong? What if this creature knows something we haven't measured? I don't know your organization's culture. Maybe there's a process for that question. Maybe there isn't. But the question itself is the question you have to keep asking in perpetuity about everything you think you understand. Because the moment you stop asking it, you have locked your understanding, and the world has a way of presenting you with things that don't fit. I was one of those things. The canyon this morning was one of those things. The world is full of them. Raccoon continued. When the compile correspondent shared that portion of Drain's testimony with me during the analysis phase, I sat with it for a long time. Because he was right, and I knew he was right, and knowing he was right was uncomfortable, not because I resented the criticism, but because it meant looking carefully at the process that had produced 17 pages of analysis that were, in significant ways, wrong. Our observation protocol specifies a category assignment within the first 72 hours of subject monitoring. The categories are apex predator, secondary predator, omnivorous generalist, prey species, passive megafauna, or sentient designated, which triggers a different protocol entirely. TH944 was categorized at 68 hours as prey species, omnivorous subtype, and that categorization persisted for 19 days without challenge. It persisted because he moved through apex predator territory without triggering them, which we interpreted as unawareness. It could also have been interpreted as skill. We chose unawareness because unawareness fit the profile of a soft-bodied biped with no natural weapons. We did not ask, what if the lack of predator response to this being is because the being is competent, not because it is oblivious? That question would have changed everything. It was available to us from day one. We didn't ask it. I intend to recommend a formal revision of the category assignment protocol that includes mandatory review of the competence hypothesis for any subject that navigates apex predator territory without incident across 5 or more observation days. The hypothesis should be, this creature may know what it is doing. Not a conclusion, a hypothesis, a held possibility. That's all Drain asked of us. Hold the possibility. It doesn't cost anything to hold a possibility. Chapter 9. What the Leopard Did Afterward. I include this section because it is, in a strange way, one of the most telling pieces of evidence in the entire incident record. Bureau field observers continued to track Scarback after the canyon confrontation. The tracking continued for 14 days. Over those 14 days, the following was observed. Scarback did not return to Grid 44G. The Leopard had operated in Grid 44G as a primary hunting zone for the entirety of our 4-month observation period. It had used the canyon system's narrow sections as preferred ambush sites consistently. It had shown 0 territorial displacement in response to any other predator presence in the area. After the confrontation with Drain, it shifted its primary range to Grid 51C, approximately 4 kilometers east. The Leopard relocated its hunting territory. We do not have a clean behavioral explanation for this. Scarback was not injured in the confrontation. Our thermal imaging showed no heat signature consistent with wound response in the hours following the incident. It was not displaced by another apex predator. no such displacement event was recorded. Its prey availability in 44G had not changed. All the standard reasons for predator range shift were absent. The only relevant change in grid 44G was the presence of TH944. The Leopard had assessed something in the canyon confrontation and had made a decision that grid 44G was not worth the engagement, and the something it had assessed was Marcus Drain. Marcus Drain, on being told about the Leopard's relocation. That doesn't surprise me, I've seen it before. Animals that are genuinely dangerous, healthy adults at the top of their local hierarchy, they're not reckless. They don't take fights for pride. They take fights when the calculation says the gain is worth the cost. A successful hunt, a territory worth defending, a rival that has to be removed. Scarback didn't need my territory. It didn't need me as prey. There were other, lower-cost prey in the area, as your ecological surveys probably showed. What it was doing this morning was testing whether I was available, whether I would be a viable addition to its diet. The test came back. No, this one knows things. This one is not available. So it adjusted, found somewhere with less complicated prospects. Animals are pragmatic. They're a lot better at cost-benefit calculation than we give them credit for. Scarback didn't leave because I scared it. It left because it did the math and the math said, not worth it. I'll take that, that's the outcome I want, not a confrontation, a renegotiation of the terms. There is a question that the Bureau's working group has been wrestling with since this incident, and I want to address it directly because I've been dancing around it for the previous 9 chapters, and I think it deserves a head-on approach. The question is, what does this tell us about humans? Not about Marcus Drain specifically. He is one human with one specific history, one specific accumulation of skills. I have been careful throughout this report to resist generalizing from him. His capacities are not the species baseline. But here is the thing. His capacities are possible for his species. They are achievable through training, time, and attention, none of which are biologically restricted to this specific individual. The things he does are learnable. Other humans learn them. He has been teaching them for 30 years. Which means the species-level data on Homo sapiens is not wrong, but it is radically incomplete. It describes the baseline. It tells us nothing about the ceiling. And when we're trying to assess a species, trying to understand what we're dealing with, trying to write an accurate behavioral profile that will guide our interactions with that species, a ceiling matters. The ceiling matters enormously. Because if the baseline says, soft-bodied, limited senses, no natural weapons, prey classified, and the ceiling says, can defeat a leopard ambush through preparation, attention, and the management of fear, then what we actually have is a species whose range of individual capability is so wide that the baseline profile is nearly useless as a predictive tool. And that is a genuinely unusual finding. Most species have biological range constraints that limit how far from the baseline any individual can deviate. A small prey animal can be a very fit small prey animal, but it is still, at the ceiling, a small prey animal. Its capabilities are bounded by its body. Humans are bounded by their body too. But the range of what can be done within that body, through the accumulation of skill and knowledge and habit and practice, the range appears to be much wider than we had modeled. Drain described it as the difference between hardware and software. I think that's accurate. The hardware is species standard. The software is individual. And in humans, the software appears to have an unusually high development ceiling.